The Red River of the North runs south to north along the border between Minnesota and what was, in 1874, the western edge of the state's settled agricultural territory and the eastern edge of the Dakota Territory. The valley it occupies the bed of the ancient glacial lake, Agassiz, which had covered this entire region under hundreds of feet of fresh water 11,000 years ago before draining northward to Hudson Bay, is among the flattest land surfaces on Earth. For hundreds of miles in every direction from the river, the former lake bed is a clay plain so level that water does not drain but stands in shallow lakes and wetlands until it evaporates. And the horizon is so unobstructed that a person standing on this ground can see the weather from an hour away in any direction. This flatness has a specific consequence in winter. There is nothing to deflect the Arctic air that descends from Hudson Bay across the Canadian plains when the high-pressure systems of the deep winter push cold air southward. The Red River Valley of Minnesota and North Dakota receives some of the most extreme winter cold in the continental United States outside of Alaska, with temperatures that fall below -40 degrees Fahrenheit in the most severe winters with a regularity that the agricultural settlements of the 1870s had not fully anticipated. The settlers who came to Polk County, Minnesota, in the early and middle 1870s, primarily Norwegian immigrants who had come through the established Norwegian communities of southeastern Minnesota and Iowa, drawn by the availability of homestead land in the Red River Valley, brought with them the cold weather knowledge of people from Norway's interior valleys and coastal regions, which was substantial but which had not prepared them for the specific character of a Red River Valley winter: flat, exposed, windswept, with no forest and no terrain to moderate the Arctic intrusions. Astrid Lindquist had come to the Red River Valley in 1872 with her husband Eric, who had been a farmer in Telemark County, Norway, before emigrating to Minnesota in 1868. They had spent 4 years in the Norwegian community of Fillmore County in southeastern Minnesota before Eric's decision to take a homestead claim in Polk County, along the Red River Valley south of Crookston, drew them north and west to the flat clay plain. Eric had filed the homestead claim in the spring of 1872 and had begun the sod-breaking that first summer. He had died of pneumonia in November of 1873, 6 weeks before the first full Polk County winter arrived, leaving Astrid at 38, with a half-built sod house, a quarter section of partially broken prairie, 2 sons, Gunnar, 16, and Lars, 13, and the approaching winter of 1873–74. The winter of 1873–74 was difficult but not exceptional by Red River Valley standards. The 3 Lindquists survived it in the sod house, with the wood stove burning the small wood supply Eric had laid in, and the chips Astrid and the boys collected from the prairie in October. The sod house was cold, its single window admitted wind through the poorly fitted frame, and the door leaked heat from the gaps between the doorboards and the frame, but it was adequate. Astrid noted in her Norwegian language diary, a cloth-bound book she had brought from Telemark, in which she wrote in the Bokmål Norwegian, that was her native written language, that the winter was hard but survivable, and that the sod house performed as sod houses performed: cold at the walls, tolerable at the stove, very cold before the morning fire. What she observed through that first winter, with the attention of a person who had grown up in the Telemark Valley and who knew snow as a material rather than simply as a weather event, was that the wind was the primary enemy in the Red River Valley, in a way that it was not in Norway. In Norway's interior valleys, the terrain channeled and moderated the wind. The forests broke it. The mountains stopped it. On the Polk County clay plain there was no terrain, no forest, no mountains. The winter wind came from the northwest in sustained blows that drove the cold directly through the sod house's walls and around its door and window, making the interior temperature a function of the wind's penetration as much as the stove's output. She had grown up hearing about snow construction from her father, who had been a dairy farmer in the Telemark interior and who had built snow shelters for his cattle and horses during extreme storms. When the barn was inadequate or inaccessible, simple structures, piled and packed snow over a mold of stacked firewood, the firewood removed after the snow had set into a self-supporting arch, leaving a hollow vault inside that was warmer than the open air by 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, because of snow's insulating properties and because the vaults enclosed air warmed from the animal's body heat. Her father had called these SNE Velv in Norwegian snow vaults and had used them as emergency structures, not as primary shelters. She had helped build them as a child, and had understood the principle. An arch of snow, like an arch of stone, distributes the weight of the snow above it along the curve of the arch rather than concentrating it at any single point, which means it does not collapse under its own weight or under the weight of additional snow accumulation the way a flat-roofed structure would, and a vault of sufficient thickness. Her father's cattle vaults had been 8 to 12 inches of packed snow on all surfaces, insulates the interior from the outdoor temperature by the same principle as any other dense, still attraping material. She had thought about the snow vault through the winter of 1873 to 74, watching the wind work on the sod house's flat vertical walls and thinking about the difference between a flat wall with corners, which gave the wind surfaces to push against and edges to work through, and a curved surface with no corners, where the wind could find no edge and no flat face, and was deflected around the curve rather than through it. She had understood this from the cattle vaults in Telemark. The storms that drove snow and wind across the valley would pile drifts against the windward side of the snow vault, and those drifts added insulation rather than penetrating as they would through a flat wall. The vault accumulated its own protection. She built the snow barrel vault in January of 1875, during the winter of 1874 to 75. She had chosen January because that winter's snow accumulation by mid-December had given her sufficient material on the ground. The Red River Valley had received approximately 36 inches of snow by December, with the clay flat holding the snow without significant compaction, and because the February cold was typically more extreme than January's, and she wanted the vault established before the worst of the season arrived. The construction method she used was the one her father had used for the cattle shelters, adapted in scale for a human habitation. She and Gunnar built a mold of stacked firewood logs along the ground, approximately 12 feet long and 5 feet in diameter at the widest point, tapering slightly at both ends. The mold was roughly the shape of half a barrel, a half-cylinder, with rounded ends, and represented the interior volume she intended to create. She had calculated the interior dimensions from the family's actual space needs. 12 feet by 5 feet, with a 4.5-foot ceiling at the vault's peak, was sufficient for 3 people to sleep and move in. The ends would have a door cut at one end, blocked with a pine board door she had salvaged from the sod house's unused partition, and a small vent hole at the other end for air circulation. Gunnar and she spent 2 days packing snow over the firewood mold. First a layer of loose snow, then a packed layer using the flat wooden paddle she had adapted from a butter paddle, then more loose snow and more packing. She wet the packed snow surface lightly with water carried from the melted interior snow supply, which froze on the surface overnight and added a structural crust to each layer. The total wall thickness when she was finished was approximately 10 to 12 inches of compacted, partially ice-bonded snow on all surfaces. She had constructed a half-cylinder of compacted snow, 12 feet long, 5 feet wide, and nearly 5 feet high at the peak, sitting on the Polk County clay flat. On the third day she and Gunnar pulled the firewood logs out from inside, through the end opening, one log at a time, until the interior was hollow. The snow vault held. The arch distributed the weight of the accumulated snow exactly as her father's cattle vaults had held. No cracks, no settling, no collapse at the peak, where the arch's keystone geometry kept the vault in compression rather than tension. The interior was raw packed snow on all surfaces, which she lined with 2 layers of flattened grain sacks for insulation against direct contact and to reduce moisture drip from the ceiling as the interior air warmed. She moved the bedding into the vault on January 14, 1875, interior temperature without any heat source, at an outdoor temperature of 12 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees without any fire, from snow's thermal insulation alone. She lit a small candle and left it burning at the far end. The interior warmed to 34 degrees within an hour from the candle's heat alone. With the small iron brazier she had moved from the sod house, burning a controlled amount of chips, the interior reached 44 degrees within 90 minutes and held. Lars recorded in the school diary he was required to keep for the Polk County School District, a document that is in the Polk County Historical Society collection in Crookston, donated by Lars Lindquist's granddaughter in 1968, that the first night in the snow shelter was, in his words, the warmest I had been since October. This was January 14, 1875. The outdoor temperature that night dropped to -18 degrees Fahrenheit, The vault interior was at 38 degrees with the brazier banked. The neighbors who had observed the construction process, the Eriksson family to the north, whose own homestead was 3/4 of a mile along the clay flat, and the Bergman family to the south had expressed their opinions during the 2 days of snowpacking. Ole Eriksson had ridden by on the second day and stopped his horse to watch for several minutes. He had asked Astrid what she was building. She had told him, a snow vault for winter sleeping, on the Norwegian dairy barn model. He had looked at the half-cylinder of packed snow. He had said, "It looks like a barrel lying on its side." She had said, "Yes, that is the shape." He had said, "Snow will not hold." She had said, "An arch holds." He had looked at the arch. He had not replied and had ridden on. His wife, Britta Eriksson, had come to see it after the construction was complete, when the firewood mold had been removed and the vault stood hollow. She had stood at the entrance and looked inside and said, "It is small and it is made of snow, and when it melts you will have nothing." Astrid had said, "It will not melt until April, when the outdoor temperature stays above freezing for days at a time, and by April I will not need it." Britta had said, "What will the other families think?" Astrid had said, "What do they think of being cold in their sod houses?" The specific event that confirmed the vault was the Arctic intrusion of January 22nd through 27th, 1875. The winter of 1874–75 produced the most extreme cold in the Red River Valley's settlement era record to that point, a 5-day period in late January during which the temperature fell to -45 degrees Fahrenheit at the Crookston weather station, and to what Lars's diary describes as far below any I have seen a thermometer. Read at the Lindquist homestead. The wind during this period was from the northwest at 15 to 25 miles per hour, with gusts that Astrid recorded in her own diary as strong enough to make standing upright difficult. The Eriksson sod house. The wind drove through the northwest corner gap in the sod wall during the first night, January 22nd, and extinguished the wood stove twice from the cold air drawn through the wall by the stove's up. Ole Eriksson spent the night rebuilding the fire repeatedly and burned through 3 weeks' worth of wood supply in 5 days. He wrote about this in a letter to his brother in Iowa, which the Poquet County Historical Society has a copy of. 5 days like that, and I do not think we would have had enough wood to last the rest of the winter. The Bergman frame house, which was better built than the Eriksson sod house, maintained adequate temperature, but at a wood consumption rate that Bergman recorded in his farm account book as alarming. 4 cords in 5 days, at a rate he had not anticipated, and that came close to exhausting his supply before the cold broke on January 27th. The Lindquist snow vault. On the morning of January 23rd, at the depth of the cold, Lars recorded in his school diary, vault interior at 42 degrees, brazier burning to chips per hour. Outside, Ole Eriksson said -45, wind from northwest. Snow vault does not move in the wind. I can hear the wind outside, but it does not come in. There are no corners. The vault temperature is higher today than any day in the sod house this winter. No corners. Lars had identified the structural reason for the vault's performance in the wind. There were no corners. A flat-walled structure has corners at every junction of 2 walls, and at every corner the wind finds an edge to work through. The differential pressure between the windward face and the leeward face forcing air through whatever gap exists at the corner joint. A continuous curved surface has no corners and no edges in the wind direction. The air is deflected around the curve and does not find a pressure differential to exploit. The vault's interior wind penetration during the January 22nd through 27th event, none that Lars or Astrid recorded. The wind was audible from outside, it did not enter. Astrid wrote in her diary on January 25th, the coldest day of the event, in Norwegian, January 25th, 1875, Dag 3 AV, Den Kaldi H. Velvington KL, 739 grader, Ute Anslet, -45, Ingen Vindin, H. Velvinja Riktig, January 25th, 1875, day 3 of the cold period. Vault temp at 7 o'clock, 39 degrees. Outside estimated -45, no wind inside. The vault is right. The vault is right. The Norwegian phrase she used, HFLVN, Riktig, carried the specific meaning of right, in the sense of correct in its principle, sound in its reasoning, proven in its design. It was the same judgment she had made about snow arches when her father built the cattle vaults in Telemark 30 years earlier, and that she had been turning over since the winter of 1873 to 74. An arch distributes load, a curved surface deflects wind, snow insulates. These three facts, combined in a barrel vault of sufficient thickness, produced a shelter that was warmer and more windproof than anything else available on the Polk County Clayflat in January of 1875. Ole Eriksson came to see the vault on January 28th, the day after the cold broke. He stood at the entrance and looked inside. The interior was 40 degrees at 10 in the morning with no heat source running. His own sod house, with the wood stove burning, was 36 degrees. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How did you build the arch?" She showed him the method with a model she built from snow in the yard, the firewood mold, the packing, the wetting, the removal. He watched the model arch hold its shape when she removed the mold stick. He said, "My father built stone arches in Norway." He understood that what held a stone arch held a snow arch. He built his own snow vault in February of 1875, with Gunnar's assistance, and used it for sleeping through the remainder of that winter and the following 2 winters. He told the Bergman family the method in March of 1875, after the snow had softened enough to make new construction inadvisable for that season. But while the memory of the January cold was specific and recent, Bergman built his vault in December of 1875, the first construction of the following winter. By the winter of 1876 to 77, for Polk County homesteads along the Red River Valley south of Crookston were using snow barrel vaults as winter sleeping shelters. Lindquist, Eriksson, Bergman, and the newly arrived Haugen family, who had heard of the method from Eriksson before their first winter. Astrid noted the Haugen adoption in her diary in December 1876. Haugen family arrived October, built their vault in November, before the first deep snow. Gunnar helped them pull the mold. They are warm. She recorded the 4-family adoption the same way she recorded everything, as a datum, with the specific facts, without elaboration or satisfaction, expressed in the prose. The diary was a record. The record noted what had happened. Lars Lindquist, interviewed by the Polk County Historical Society in 1939 at the age of 77, said of his mother's snow vault, "She had built them for cattle with her father in Norway. She looked at the flat ground here, and the northwest wind, and she knew what would work." The vault did not argue with the wind. The sod house argued. The vault just curved and let it go past. The vault just curved and let it go past. This was the structural principle in its most compressed form. In the language of a man who had slept in the vault as a 13-year-old, and who had felt the difference between the sod house's argument with the wind and the vault's non-argument with it. A flat wall opposes the wind, a curve deflects it. The wind works on opposition and finds nothing to work on in deflection. The Polk County Historical Society in Crookston, Minnesota, has the Lindquist family diary donated by Astrid's granddaughter in 1961. Lars's school diary from Polk County School District 1874 to 75, donated 1968 by Lars's granddaughter, and a photograph of the Lindquist snow vault taken in February 1876, the second winter's vault, by a traveling photographer who was documenting the Norwegian settlements of the Red River Valley. The photograph shows a half-cylinder of packed snow in the foreground, approximately 12 feet long and 5 feet high, with a pine board door visible at the near end and what appears to be a vent hole at the far end, and the flat Polk County clay plain stretching to the horizon behind it. The half-cylinder. From the outside it looked, as Ole Eriksson had said on the second day of construction, like a barrel lying on its side. Eriksson had meant this as a description of something unusual and perhaps impractical. He had been right that it looked like a barrel. He had been wrong about the impractical. HVLVNR Richtig. The vault is right. She had known it from her father's cattle shelters in Telemark, and from one winter of watching the wind work on the flat walls of the Polk County sod house. The January 1875 cold had confirmed it with the most extreme conditions the Red River Valley's settlement era had produced. The vault temperature was higher on the coldest day of that event than the sod house temperature on any day of the winter. The record says so. The Polk County Historical Society has the record. It is still there. The vault is the only curve on the flat horizon in the photograph, and it was enough, and the record says so. The physics of the snow barrel vault, which Astrid had understood through practice rather than through the mathematical formulations that structural engineers would use to describe it, operates through 4 distinct mechanisms. each contributing to the vault's thermal and structural performance in the January 1875 conditions. The first mechanism is snow's thermal insulation. Snow is a porous material in which still air is trapped between ice crystals, and still air is a poor conductor of heat. The thermal conductivity of compacted snow at the density Astrid achieved, approximately 350 kilograms per cubic meter, which is the density of firmly packed snow before it begins to transform toward firn, is approximately 0.3 watts per meter per Kelvin, compared to 0.0254 still air and 0.04 for loose dry snow. At 10 to 12 inches of wall thickness, a snow vault provides insulation roughly equivalent to 8 to 10 inches of compacted earth, modest by the standard of a deeply buried structure, but substantially better than a single-layer sod wall, and far better than a frame house wall of the period. The critical difference from a sod house is not the absolute insulation value, but the continuity. The snow vault's walls are a continuous gapless surface. The sod house wall is assembled from sod bricks with joints between them, and it is the joints that fail first in extreme wind conditions, allowing cold air infiltration that no amount of additional fuel can overcome. The snow vault has no joints, no corners, no window frames, no door frame gaps, except the single controlled opening at the entrance. The insulation is continuous, and the air infiltration is minimal. The second mechanism is the arch's structural stability. A barrel vault distributes the compressive load of the snow above it, along the curve of the arch to the ground at the vault's base, rather than concentrating it at the top. This means the vault does not require internal support, does not push outward at its walls under load, and does not collapse when additional snow accumulates on its exterior. The additional accumulation adds insulation rather than structural threat. A flat-roofed snow structure would collapse under its own weight at the dimensions Astrid built. A barrel vault at those dimensions is inherently stable. The third mechanism is wind deflection. A convex curved surface in a wind flow creates a pressure distribution around the curve, in which the wind is accelerated over the top, and the pressure on the windward face is distributed continuously around the curve, rather than concentrated at a flat face. A flat wall creates a high-pressure zone on its windward face that drives air through any gap in the wall. A curved surface distributes this pressure differential along the curve without creating a single high-pressure point, and the continuous surface gives the wind nothing to work through. The infiltration that destroyed the Ericsson sod house's thermal performance on January 22, 1875, cold air driven through the northwest corner gap by the pressure differential between the windward and leeward faces of the flat sod wall, was geometrically impossible in the vault. There were no corners to fail. The fourth mechanism is the stabilizing effect of the exterior drift accumulation. The northwest wind of the January 1875 event built drifts against the windward face of the vault during the 5-day period. These drifts, dense packed snow driven by the wind against the vault's northwest face, added additional insulation to the windward face and increased the vault's effective wall thickness on the side most exposed to the cold. A flat-walled sod house cannot benefit from drift accumulation in the same way, because the drift builds against the flat wall and the wind exploits whatever gap remains above the drift. The vault's curve deflects the wind over the top of the drift as well as over the vault, so the drift grows and does not undermine the structure. Astrid had not articulated these four mechanisms in the language of structural mechanics. She had articulated them in the language of observation. An arch holds the curve, deflects wind, snow insulates, the drift adds protection. These four observations, made by a woman in the Telemark interior watching her father's cattle shelters survive Norwegian valley storms, and refined through one Polk County winter of watching what the wind did to flat walls, were equivalent to the four physical mechanisms. The language was different. The understanding was the same. The construction sequence of the Lindquist snow barrel vault is worth documenting in detail, because it was the knowledge that transferred from Astrid to Ericsson to Bergman to Haugen, and because the details are what distinguished a functional vault from a collapsed pile of snow. The firewood mold. The key decision was the mold's shape, which determined the vault's interior shape. Astrid built the mold from stacked firewood logs, which she and Gunnar had cut in October from the cottonwood along the Red River bank, the only timber available in the Polk County Valley. The logs were approximately 4 feet long and 4 to 6 inches in diameter, stacked on the ground in a shape that approximated half a barrel. A base layer of parallel logs forming the floor of the future interior. then progressively shorter stacks on each side, rising to a single log or pair of logs at the peak of the intended arch. The total mold height was approximately 4.5 feet from the ground, and the total mold length was 12 feet. The shaping of the arch cross-section was the most technically demanding part. Astrid wanted the arch to be a true semicircle, rather than a pointed arch. Because a semicircular vault distributes load most evenly, and because the semicircle was what her father's cattle vaults had used, she built the firewood mold in cross-section to approximate a semicircle of 5 feet diameter, meaning the mold was 2.5 feet from base to peak and 5 feet from side to side. This gave the interior a 5-foot width and a 4.5-foot ceiling height at the vault's center. The snow packing. She and Gunnar worked from the outside, first packing the loose snow of the December accumulation onto the mold by hand, then packing each layer with the flat wooden paddle. The packing technique was specific. She drove the paddle into the loose snow at an angle and pushed horizontally, compressing the snow against the underlying layer, rather than pressing down from above, which would tend to collapse the mold. Each layer was packed to a thickness of approximately 2 inches before the next loose layer was added. The wetting water carried from melted interior snow supply and applied to the packed surface with a cloth was done between layers and at the final surface, creating an ice bond that added tensile strength to the compressive strength of the packed snow. Total construction time, 2 days for 2 people working steadily. The mold removal required 3 hours on the 3rd morning. Gunnar went in at the entrance end and passed the logs out to Astrid, one at a time, working from the back of the mold toward the entrance, the arch held with each log removed. When the last log was out, Gunnar stood inside a hollow snow vault, and the arch showed no cracking or settling. The vent hole at the far end. Astrid had planned this from the cattle vault experience. A sealed snow vault accumulates moisture from respiration and from the warmth of the interior, and the moisture condenses on the ceiling and drips. A single vent hole approximately 3 inches in diameter at the vault's peak, at the far end, allowed moisture-laden, warm air to exit by convection, replacing it with drier cold air from the entrance end. The vent hole was sized by experience. Her father had used a vent hole in the cattle vaults that was approximately 1/10 the cross-sectional area of the interior, which for Astrid's vault translated to approximately 3 inches in diameter. The vent hole also served as an emergency exit if the entrance became blocked by drifting snow. She and Gunnar could enlarge it from inside in minutes with the paddle. These details, the mold shape, the packing technique, the wetting schedule, the vent hole sizing, were what Astrid showed Ole Eriksson in the yard model demonstration on January 28th, and what Eriksson passed to Bergman in March, and what Bergman passed to the Haugen family in December 1875. The knowledge transferred as technique, not as principle. This is how you build the mold. This is how you pack. This is where the vent goes. The principle arch, curve, insulation, drift was implicit in the technique and was understood by anyone who used the vault through a Polk County winter. The Haugen family's adoption of the technique. They built their vault in November 1875, before the first deep snow of that winter, represented the technique's first transmission to a family with no direct connection to Norwegian snow construction tradition. Nils Haugen had come from Rogaland County on Norway's west coast, where snow construction was not a traditional practice because the maritime climate moderated the temperatures. He had learned the technique entirely from Eriksson's description of the Lindquist method, and his vault, built with Gunnar Lindquist's assistance in the actual construction, was successful from the first winter. He needed the technique, not the ancestral knowledge, because the technique was sufficient. Astrid had encoded the principle in the procedure. The school diary that Lars Lindquist kept for the Polk County School District during the winter of 1874-75 is a document worth describing beyond the entries that bear directly on the snow vault, because it provides the external record of a 13-year-old's experience of the entire winter sequence: the construction, the mockery, the extreme cold, and the confirmation. Lars had been attending the Polk County School District's winter session. The school operated only in winter, when farm work did not require the children, and was required to keep a diary of his daily observations as part of the district's educational program. The diary was to include weather observations, family activities, and observations of nature. It was submitted to the teacher at the end of the winter session, and was kept in the district's records, which eventually became part of the Polk County Historical Society collection. The entries from January 1875 are the most detailed in the diary. Lars wrote every day during the vault construction period, during the Ericsson and Bergman visits, and during the January 22nd through 27th extreme cold event. The entries are in English. He was 13 and had been in Minnesota long enough to be writing his school diary in English, though his home language was Norwegian, and they have the specific quality of a 13-year-old's observations, concrete, immediate, unanalyzed, and therefore historically valuable, in the way that unmediated primary accounts are always valuable. January 12, 1875. Mother and Gunnar started building the snow house today. They stacked the firewood logs in the shape of a half-barrel lying down and began packing snow on top. Mr. Ericsson rode by and stopped and watched for a long time. He asked what they were building, and Mother told him a snow vault for sleeping. He said it looked like a barrel on its side. He went away. Mother and Gunnar kept packing. January 14, 1875. The snow house is finished. We moved the bedding inside tonight. The vault temperature was 28 degrees without any fire, which is warmer than the sod house has been at any point this winter. We lit the brazier, and it went to 44 degrees in an hour and a half. I slept warmer than I have since October. Mrs. Ericsson came to see it and said, "When it melts, we will have nothing." Mother said it will not melt until April. It did not melt that night. January 23, 1875. Day 2 of the cold weather. Mr. Ericsson said it was -45 at his place yesterday. The vault was 42 degrees at 7 this morning with the brazier burning to chips an hour. I can hear the wind outside, but it does not come inside. There are no corners. In the sod house the wind came through the northwest corner in January, and Father had to stuff rags in the gap. There are no corners in the vault. There is nothing for the wind to come through. There are no corners. Lars had stated the structural principle in the plainest possible terms. In a school diary entry dated January 23, 1875, when he was 13 years old, the vault did not have corners. The wind needed corners. The vault provided none. The Polk County Historical Society archivist, who catalogued the school diary in 1968, noted, Lars Lindqvist's, January 23, 1875. Entry contains what may be the earliest known lay description of wind infiltration resistance in curved wall snow construction in the Polk County settlement record. The entry's observation that there are no corners for the wind to penetrate captures the primary structural advantage of barrel vault construction over flat-walled construction in wind-driven cold conditions. The archivist appears to have been an engineer as well as a historian, because the note is precise in a way that suggests technical understanding of what Lars had observed. Lars had stated it at 13 without knowing that he was describing a structural principle. He had felt the difference, the wind audible outside, not felt inside, and he had identified the reason from his own observation of the sod house's failure mode. The northwest corner gap. There was no northwest corner in the vault. The observation was sufficient. The record was sufficient. The Polk County Historical Society has it. H. Velven. Richtig, the vault is right. The record says so. It always did. The economic dimension of the snow barrel vault, which Astrid had calculated in the back pages of her diary in the spring of 1875, after the January cold had confirmed the vault's thermal advantage, reveals a fuel efficiency gain that parallels the gains documented in the other accounts in this series, though it operates through a different mechanism. The Lindqvist family's fuel consumption comparison. Winter of 1873 to 74. Sod house only, using the wood stove for all heating. Total wood and chips consumed, approximately 9 cords of wood equivalent. Winter of 1874 to 75. Sleeping in the snow vault from January 14th onward, heating only the sod house during daytime activities. Wood and chips consumed for the full winter, approximately 6 cords equivalent. The reduction in the second winter, 3 cords, from 9 to 6. This was not entirely attributable to the vault. The second winter was somewhat warmer than the first in its early months, but the January period, when the extreme cold coincided with the vault sleeping arrangement, was the period of greatest difference. Astrid's specific calculation from the January 22nd through 27th extreme cold period. The vault required 2 chips per hour from the brazier to maintain 42 degrees. The equivalent sod house heating for the same period, she estimated, from the Ericsson family's experience, would have required a wood fire consuming approximately 3 times as much fuel to maintain a lower temperature. The vault achieved 42 degrees on 2 chips per hour. The Ericsson sod house maintained approximately 36 degrees on the full wood stove for the same period, at a consumption rate all Ericsson described in his letter to his Iowa brother as the most alarming 5 days of fuel consumption I have experienced. She wrote the comparison in the diary. Jan-February 1875, summary. Volt fuel, small brazier, 2 chips per hour, average, 5 weeks sleeping use. Sod house fuel, main stove, required for cooking and daytime warmth only. Total winter fuel, 6 cords equivalent. Previous winter, 9 cords full sod house heating. Ericsson estimate, 8 to 9 cords this winter with full sod house heating. Volt saved approximately 3 cords over the full winter, estimated 4 to 5 cords compared to Ericsson full sod house equivalent. She did not underline any number, she wrote them all in the same hand and on the same page. 3 to 5 cords of saved fuel was, at Polk County wood prices in 1875, approximately $7 to $12, on a homestead whose total cash income in the first years of operation was limited to whatever surplus grain could be sold to the Crookston dealers. $7 to $12 was a significant fraction of the annual cash economy, but the more important resource than money was the wood supply itself. The Red River Valley had limited accessible timber. The cottonwood along the riverbank was being depleted by the growing settlement, and a homestead that required 9 cords per winter would exhaust its accessible timber faster than a homestead that could manage on 6. The Volt extended the time before the fuel supply problem became critical. Astrid did not frame this as an economic calculation in the diary. She wrote the numbers without the financial conclusion. The connection between the numbers and the timber depletion problem was one the reader could make from the context. The diary's earlier entries noted the difficulty of accessing timber and the cost of purchased wood from the dealers, but she did not draw it explicitly. She recorded what she had measured and left the implications in the record. The Norwegian knowledge tradition that Astrid brought to Polk County in 1872, and specifically the snow construction knowledge from her father's Telemark dairy farming practice, was not unique to Telemark or to Norway. Similar practices existed in Finnish, Swedish, Sami-Yan, other northern European winter farming traditions, and the indigenous peoples of the Canadian and American subarctic had developed snow construction techniques over thousands of years that were far more sophisticated than the emergency cattle shelter that Astrid's father had built in Telemark Valley storms. What Astrid had was a specific practical knowledge that had transferred from her father to her, through participation rather than through instruction. She had helped build the cattle vaults, not been taught about them in the abstract, and that had survived the immigration from Norway to Minnesota in 1868, and the 4 years in the southeastern Minnesota Norwegian community where snow conditions did not require its application. The knowledge had been in her for 6 years before the Polk County clay flat gave her a reason to use it. It had waited in the form of embodied technique, the memory of the mold shape, the packing method, the wetting, the vent hole, through 4 years in Fillmore County where the terrain and timber made snow construction unnecessary, and through the winter of 1873 to 74 in Polk County when she was watching the wind and thinking about the flat walls. It activated in the winter of 1874 to 75 when the combination of extreme cold, inadequate sod house performance, and sufficient snow accumulation made the decision clear. This is the pattern that appears across the accounts in this series. Knowledge acquired in one context and held without application until a new context makes it relevant and available. Martha Pyle had used the Missouri cave for sweet potato storage since 1851 and measured its temperature every winter before the 1867 crisis made it a habitation rather than a storage space. Harriet Osgood had measured the Idaho geothermal spring in 1874, a burn injury, and held that measurement for 3 years, until the 1873 legislative report gave it a use. Vera Malone had observed the dense compressed chips in the spring 1879 collection and held the hypothesis through the summer until she could test it in August. Astrid Lindquist had built snow cattle vaults with her father in Telemark in the 1840s and 1850s. And held that technique through 20 years of immigration and settlement until the Polk County winter of 1874-75 made it necessary. The knowledge had been there. The context had finally required it. The construction had followed. The January cold had confirmed it. The photograph in the Polk County Historical Society collection, taken in February 1876 by a traveling photographer documenting Norwegian settlements, shows the second winter's vault. The one built after the January 1875 cold had confirmed the first vault's performance, and after Eriksson had built his own. The second Lindquist vault is visible in the photograph as a half-cylinder of packed snow approximately 12 feet long and 5 feet high, with a pine board door visible at the near end. In the background, the Poquet County clay flat stretches to the horizon with no terrain feature and no tree visible. The vault is the only curve in the landscape. Everything else is flat. The vault is the only curve in the landscape. Astrid had put the only curve in the Poquet County clay flat, and the curve had let the Arctic wind go past it, while the flat-walled structures around it accumulated drift and infiltration and burned through their fuel supplies. The curve was the principle. Her father's cattle vaults in Telemark had known it. She had brought it across the Atlantic and across 6 years of Minnesota settlement to a quarter section south of Crookston. And the January 1875 Arctic intrusion had proved it as completely as any confirmation could prove a principle. H. Velven E.R. Richtig, The Vault is Right. Lars Lindquist, interviewed by the Poquet County Historical Society at 77 in 1939, was asked whether he remembered the first night in the snow vault. He said, "I remember that it was January 14, 1875, and that the outdoor temperature that night was minus 18 degrees. I remember that the vault was 38 degrees with the brazier banked, and that I had not been that warm since October. I remember that I could hear the wind outside and that it did not come inside. I remember thinking that the vault was better at being outside than the sod house was, if that makes sense. The vault was outside, made of snow, and it was warmer than the house inside. I thought, she was right about this." My father would have said, she was right about it. He was very good at knowing which things worked. My father would have said she was right about it. He was very good at knowing which things worked. Lars had not known his father's opinion of the snow vault because his father had died in November of 1873, 6 weeks before the first Poquet County winter arrived. He had constructed the opinion he thought his father would have had, from his knowledge of what his father valued. His father had been a farmer who valued things that worked. The vault worked. His father would have said she was right. She had been right. The January 1875 cold had confirmed it. The Poquet County Historical Society has the diary and the school diary and the photograph. The January 25th entry in Astrid's diary, H. Velven Richtig, The Vault is Right, is on the page it has been on since January 26, 1875, when she wrote it the morning after. The school diary's January 23rd entry, There Are No Corners, is on the page it has been on since January 24th, when Lars wrote it in the same cold, and wrote it accurately. The vault is right. There are no corners. The record is sufficient. It always was, and it still is, and the Poquet County Historical Society has it in Crookston, Minnesota, where it has been since Astrid's granddaughter and Lars's granddaughter donated the 2 diaries and the photograph in 1961 and 1968. The half-cylinder in the photograph is the only curve on the flat horizon. It was enough. The specific question of what Ole Eriksson understood when Astrid demonstrated the arch principle with the small snow model on January 28, 1875, the day after the extreme cold broke, is worth examining, because the speed of his conversion from skeptic to practitioner reveals something about how practical knowledge transfers between people who share a foundational understanding, even when they have arrived at the specific application from different directions. Eriksson had come to Poquet County from Hordaland County on Norway's western coast, a region where stone arch construction was a common practice in bridge building and in the construction of farm buildings. He had grown up seeing stone arches and understanding, at a functional level, that an arch distributed load along its curve to the supports at the base, and that this distribution was what allowed stone arches to span distances that flat lintels could not span without intermediate support. He had never thought of this principle in connection with snow, because in Hordaland the maritime climate did not produce the snow depths or the extreme temperatures that would make snow construction practically interesting. When Astrid made the small snow arch in the yard and removed the stick that had served as its mold, and the arch held, Eriksson had the immediate recognition of a person seeing a familiar principle in an unfamiliar material. He said, "My father built stone arches in Norway," not, "I see how the arch distributes load in snow as in stone." But the statement implied the understanding. The arch principle that his father had used in stone was the same arch principle Astrid had used in snow, and he had understood it in stone for 20 years. The principle was already in him. Astrid had shown him the material. This was a different kind of knowledge transfer from the others documented in this series. Not a transfer of technique to someone who had no prior understanding of the principle, but a recognition by someone who already understood the principle in one material of the same principle in a different material. The transfer required only the demonstration, not the instruction. Astrid had not explained why the arch held. She had shown it holding, and Ericsson had known why from his own background. He built his vault in February of 1875, and it worked in its first construction because he had understood the principle before he built. There were no failed attempts, no refinements required across multiple seasons. He had seen the arch hold in Astrid's yard demonstration, and he had built it from that understanding. The knowledge had met the prior understanding and produced competence on first attempt. This is the fastest form of practical knowledge transfer, and it requires the specific coincidence of the knowledge with the prior understanding in the recipient. Astrid had been fortunate in her neighbor. Ericsson's stone arch background gave him the frame for the snow arch the moment he saw it. The Bergman and Haugen families, who came to the technique without that specific background, required more detailed instruction and guidance in the actual construction. They succeeded, but the process was longer and required Gunnar Lindqvist's direct assistance in construction rather than a yard demonstration. The technique was the same for all 4 families. The path to competence was different. The result, a functional snow barrel vault on a Pokey County clay flat, was the same at the end of any of the paths. H.F. Elven, E.R. Richtig. The vault is right. The principle that Astrid's father had applied to cattle shelters in Limmark Valley storms in the 1840s and 1850s had traveled across the Atlantic and across 6 years of Minnesota settlement to a quarter section of Pokey County clay flat, and it had been right all along, and the January 1875 Arctic intrusion had simply confirmed it in the most extreme conditions available. The record is in Crookston. It is still there. The vault is the only curve on the flat horizon in the photograph, and it was enough, and the record says so. The vault just curved and let it go past. That was all.